The moment Mabel Dawson stepped off the wagon, the laughter started. She heard it before she saw them. A cluster of men outside the general store, elbows nudging elbows, one of them actually pointing. A tall rancher named Dillard Creech cupped his hands around his mouth and called out loud enough for the whole frozen street to hear, "Ethan Caldwell ordered himself a bride and they sent him a whole barn instead." The laughter cracked through the cold air like a whip. Women on the boardwalk covered their mouths but didn't look away. A boy of maybe 10 repeated the word barn and got cuffed by his mother. But she was still smiling when she did it. Mabel didn't stop walking. She had one suitcase, worn leather handles wrapped in a strip of cloth, where they'd started to split. And she carried it herself because there was no one offering to help. Her boots were solid, her coat too heavy for fashion, and exactly right for weather. And she kept her chin level even though her chest felt like something had reached inside and started squeezing. If this were you, arriving in a strange town, in a strange territory, in the dead of winter, knowing nobody, what would you do? She walked towards the man standing apart from the crowd, the one who hadn't laughed. That was the only reason she knew it was him. Before we go further, if a story like this one moves you, please subscribe to this channel so you never miss what comes next. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to Wyoming, 1888, and to a woman the frontier never saw coming. Well, the letter had taken 6 weeks to reach Mabel in Cincinnati. She'd read it 3 times standing at the kitchen table of the boarding house where she'd worked the last 4 years, folding and unfolding the single page until the crease marks went white. The handwriting was careful. A man who'd learned to write and took it seriously, not someone showing off. His name was Ethan Caldwell. He ran cattle on a spread northeast of a town called Harlow, Wyoming Territory. He was 34 years old, had no family left living, and he needed a practical woman who understood hard work. He had not asked for anything else. That was, in a strange way, what made Mabel write back. She was 29. She was large. She'd known that since she was 11 years old, and her aunt had started sighing when they went to look at fabrics for new dresses. She had never been described as pretty by anyone who wasn't being paid to be kind to her. She had dark hair that went frizzy in humidity, a wide face that showed every emotion she'd ever felt, and hands that were already rough from years of cooking, cleaning, and hauling water for other people's households. She also had a mind that wouldn't sit still, and that had been more problem than gift in Cincinnati. She'd spent 4 years at the boarding house, and before that 2 years helping an old German farmer named Kraus, who ran 40 head of mixed cattle outside of Columbus. Kraus was 73, half-blind, and completely without sentiment, and he'd taught her things about animals and land and weather that she'd never found in any book but had stored away anyway, the way a person stores wood before winter without knowing exactly how bad the cold will get. She wrote back to Ethan Caldwell. She told him she was practical and she wasn't delicate. She told him she had experience with livestock, though she was careful not to overstate it. She told him she was a large woman because she had learned the hard way that surprises of that kind went badly for everyone involved. His second letter arrived 3 weeks later. It said, "I appreciate your honesty. I am not looking for decoration. When can you arrive?" She gave notice at the boarding house the next morning. Becky, bye. The journey had been 22 days in total, counting the 2 days she'd been stuck in Cheyenne waiting out a blizzard that shut down the rail line. She'd sat in a depot crowded with stranded travelers, eaten twice-cooked beans from a tin, and slept upright on a bench with her suitcase between her feet because she didn't fully trust the man who kept watching it from across the room. She hadn't told anyone in Cincinnati where she was going. There was no one, really, to tell. That particular truth she held without drama. She was not given to self-pity. It cost too much and bought too little. But she was clear-eyed about her situation, which was that she was going to a place she'd never been to, marry a man she'd never met, and the only thing she was bringing besides her suitcase was the knowledge she'd accumulated and a stubbornness that people had been trying to cure her of since childhood. The stage from Cheyenne to Harlow took most of a day. The driver was not talkative. The other passenger, a wire-thin woman in a good coat, had looked at Mabel when she climbed in and then moved her skirts aside without a word. Not out of meanness, Mabel thought, but out of the automatic calculation people made about space. She didn't take it personally. She just shifted herself into the corner and watched Wyoming Territory through the fogged window, the flat white distances, the the sky pressing down gray and serious, the occasional dark cluster of cattle standing in a hollow with their backs to the wind. She thought about Ethan Caldwell's letters, 4 of them by the time she left. They were not romantic. They had no warmth in the conventional sense, but they were direct and they were honest. And she had found, over the years, that honesty was rarer and more valuable than warmth and should be treated accordingly. She thought about Krause's place outside Columbus, the way the sick animals moved differently, slower on one side, or with their heads carried at the wrong angle, or eating without really eating, just mouthing hay without taking it in. She thought about what Krause had shown her about the land and how the land showed you what it needed if you watched it, instead of just using it. She thought about the ant who used to sigh. She folded all of it away and watched Wyoming until the stage slowed and the driver called out, "Harlow." Ethan Caldwell was standing at the edge of the street when she came around the side of the stage. She saw him before he saw her clearly, and she used that half-second to take him in. He was taller than she'd imagined, with the particular leanness of a man who worked physically and ate irregularly. He had a beard that needed maintenance and a coat that had been good quality some years ago. His hat was pulled low, and his arms were at his sides, and he was watching the stage with an expression she could only describe as braced. Then he saw her. She watched it happen, the flicker of something across his face that he tried to control and didn't fully succeed at. It wasn't cruelty. It was something more complicated and, in some ways, harder to absorb. It was adjustment. He'd had a picture in his head, and now he was revising it in real time, and the revision wasn't going smoothly. Dillard Creech called out his barn joke. The laughter went through the street like a cold wind, and Mabel felt it the same way she felt that wind, physically, across her skin, her chest tightening against it. She kept walking. She stopped a few feet from Ethan and looked at him directly, because she had decided years ago that the worst thing she could do in a moment of humiliation was look at the ground. "Mr. Caldwell," she said. "Miss Dawson." His voice was lower than she'd expected. He looked at her and then looked at the street and then looked back at her. "I wasn't... The stage was early." "I don't think it was," she said. A pause. He had the decency to look slightly ashamed of the lie. "There's a wagon," he said. "If you're ready." "I've been ready for 6 weeks," she said. They didn't talk much on the ride out to the ranch. The road was frozen hard, the wagon jolting over the ruts, and Mabel sat with her suitcase on her lap because there was no good place to put it. Ethan drove with both hands on the reins and his eyes on the road, and the silence between them was not comfortable, but it was at least honest. Neither of them pretending this was something it wasn't. The land was more than she'd imagined. Not beautiful in any soft sense. Wyoming in January didn't deal in soft. But it was enormous in a way that pressed on her chest and behind her eyes. The scale of it, the uncompromising distances, the sky that seemed to begin at the ground instead of above it. She had grown up in cities and lived in cities, and she had never understood before this moment how much of the world people in cities were simply not seeing. She saw the ranch from a quarter-mile out. Even at that distance, even in the gray light of January, she could read it the way Krause had taught her to read things. Not for what they were, but for what they told you. The barn roof had a sag on the east side. The fence line nearest the road had been patched in 4 places with different materials, which meant repairs had been made one at a time as things became critical rather than any systematic maintenance. The cattle she could see in the far pasture were standing in a group, which wasn't wrong in itself, but the group was tight. Animals clustering together beyond what cold alone would explain. "How many head?" she asked. He glanced at her. "Started the year with 62, down to 41 now." She did the math quickly. 21 animals lost in 1 year. "What took them?" "Winter, sickness. Some I sold off when the money got tight." He paused. "Mostly winter." She looked at the cattle again, still tight in their cluster, and thought about what she'd noticed from the wagon. How they were positioned relative to the wind, which direction they were facing, what the ground looked like around them. "When did they start standing like that?" she asked. Another glance, longer this time. "Like what?" "Grouped up, tight. That's not just cold behavior." A long moment. The wagon creaked over a frozen rut. "Couple weeks," he said. She nodded and didn't say anything else because she needed to see them up close before she could say anything useful. and because she could feel his resistance to being observed by her, the tension in him, the slight stiffening, the way he'd gone quiet when she started asking questions he hadn't expected. They pulled up to the house, and she climbed down before he could offer to help or decide not to. The inside of the house told her the same story as the outside, just in smaller details. A man living alone for a long time in a space he'd stopped really seeing. The woodpile was low. Not dangerously so, not yet, but lower than it should have been this far into winter, which meant either he'd started the season short or he'd been burning more than expected. The kitchen had the ghost of systematic organization, hooks and shelves placed with intention, but the intention had drifted. Things were where they'd ended up rather than where they belonged. There was a room off the main area, barely more than a partition, with a cot and a nailed-up shelf. "That's where you can—" he started. "That's fine," she said. She set her suitcase on the cot. She stood in the room for a moment and looked at the wall. She'd told herself, on the stage and before that she was not coming here with expectations, that she was a practical woman entering a practical arrangement. That sentiment was a luxury, and she didn't deal in luxuries. She'd believed it when she said it. Standing in that room, listening to Ethan Caldwell move around on the other side of the partition, doing something with a pot that seemed to involve more noise than necessary, she felt the weight of what she'd actually done. Not fear exactly. Not regret. Something more complicated and quieter than both. A recognition that this was real now, that the decision that had seemed manageable from a distance had become, in the way all real things do, complicated and immediate. She unpacked her suitcase methodically. 3 dresses, 2 work-appropriate, and 1 not. A wool shawl. Her book on plant medicine and livestock management that she'd carried since Krause's place, pages marked in the margins in pencil. A small oilskin pouch with her savings, which were modest. A photograph of her mother, who had died when Mabel was 15, and whom she didn't look at often, but couldn't leave behind. She put the book on the shelf. She went back out to the main room. Ethan had made something he called supper. It was beans and a piece of salt pork in a pan over the stove, and it was not good, but it was hot, and she ate it without comment because complaining on day 1 was not something she was willing to do. They sat at opposite ends of a table that was too large for the room and ate in silence for a while. Then he said, without looking up, "I didn't know you'd have questions. About the cattle. Was that a problem?" "No." He pushed something around his plate. "I just wasn't expecting it." "What were you expecting?" He looked up at that. The question had come out more direct than she'd intended, or maybe exactly as direct as she'd intended. She wasn't sure which. "I don't know," he said finally. "Someone who needed settling in. Someone who'd need time." "I'm settled," she said. He studied her for a moment. He had gray eyes, she noticed, and they were the most expressive thing about his face. Everything else he kept controlled, but his eyes showed things before he could catch them. What she saw now was not mockery. It wasn't the easy dismissal she'd been absorbing all day from the street in Harlow. It was something more unsettled than that. A man who'd had a plan and was realizing the plan had arrived in a shape he hadn't accounted for. "The people in town," he said. "What they said—" "I heard it," she said. "I should have—" "You didn't laugh," she said. "That's something." He was quiet for a moment. It wasn't enough. She looked at him across the long table. Outside, the wind was picking up, pushing against the walls of the house with a sound that wasn't quite sound, more like pressure, like the cold itself leaning in. "No," she said. "It wasn't, but it's a place to start from." She was up before him the next morning. She'd woken in the dark, which was nothing new. She'd always been a poor sleeper in strange places, and a worse sleeper than that when her mind was working, and her mind had been working all night. She'd lain on the cot and thought about what she'd seen on the ride in. The cattle, the way they were grouped, the east side sag in the barn roof, the patched fence, the woodpile. She dressed and went out to the barn before it was fully light. The cold hit her like a physical thing, deliberate, personal. Wyoming cold was different from Ohio cold. She hadn't quite believed that before this moment, but she believed it now. It had a quality of intention to it, as if it wasn't simply the absence of warmth, but its own active force. She pushed open the barn door and went in. The animals were close in the warm by comparison air, their breath making slow clouds in the dark. She moved along the stalls carefully, taking her time with each animal, looking and listening before she touched. This was what Krauss had drilled into her, the looking and listening, the patience before the doing. Most people go straight to the doing, he'd said, in his flat German way. Most people miss the thing they're looking for because they're already deciding what they'll find. She was on the fourth animal when she found it. A young steer, 18 months maybe, standing with a slight favoring of his left front leg. Not dramatic, a person glancing would miss it, but he was putting his weight differently, and when she ran her hand along the lower part of the leg and pressed with her thumb in specific places, the animal shifted, and not in the way of normal cold weather discomfort. She stood up and looked at the animal's eyes, then at his coat. She went back down the line, more carefully now, looking for the same things in each animal. By the time the light had started to come in through the cracks in the barn walls, she'd found 3 more with similar signs. 4 out of the 12 she'd examined. She hadn't gotten to the outside pasture yet. She heard the barn door and turned to find Ethan standing in the opening. He was dressed for work, holding a lantern he no longer needed, and he was looking at her with an expression she couldn't fully read, somewhere between surprise and irritation, and under both of those something that might have been relief, though she doubted he knew that last part. "You didn't wake me," he said. "You were asleep. I get up at 4:30. It was 3. A pause. "What are you doing?" "Looking at your cattle," she said. "This one here," she gestured toward the young steer, "has something starting in his lower leg. These 3 here have it too, or something close to it. I want to look at the ones outside before I say anything more than that." He stared at her. The lantern swayed slightly in his hand. "You can tell that from... You've been here less than a day." "I know what I'm looking for," she said. It wasn't arrogance. She said it simply, the same way she'd say the sun is up or the wood is wet. "When did you last work through the herd individually, not moving them or feeding? Individually, close, one at a time?" He didn't answer immediately. "That's what I thought," she said, not unkindly. "Show me where the outside pasture gate is and then go have your breakfast. I'll be back in an hour." He didn't go have his breakfast. He followed her to the outside pasture gate, and when she went in, he went in too. He didn't comment on what she was doing, just watched her work down the line of animals. And she let him watch because explaining what she was seeing would take longer than just doing it, and because some things were better demonstrated than described. She found 2 more with leg issues. She found 1 animal with early signs of something in his breathing she didn't like. A slight laboring, not audible at distance, but clear when you stood next to the animal and paid attention. She found 2 more that seemed well enough for now, but were carrying themselves in a way that suggested they were closer to sick than they appeared. When she came back out of the pasture, Ethan was leaning on the gate with his arms crossed. "You found something," he said. "Several somethings," she said. "Nothing I haven't seen before." Krauss, the man I worked with in Ohio, ran cattle on ground with a similar clay content in the soil. Some of it's what you'd expect from a hard winter. Some of it's preventable if you catch it early enough. He was quiet for a long moment. The wind had come back up, working at her coat collar. "Krauss," he said, "the man you worked with. For 2 years. Before the boarding house. You didn't say... In your letters, you said you had some experience with livestock." "Some experience," she said, seemed accurate. Something shifted in his face. Not softened. That wasn't the right word. More like he was recalculating. She'd seen it before from Krauss the first week. The particular expression a man gets when a woman has done something he wasn't expecting, and he can't decide if he's impressed or threatened or both. "What would you do," he said, "with the ones you found?" She told him. Not everything. Not yet, because she wanted to look more closely and think it through. But the basic outline of it: separate the ones showing symptoms, change their feed slightly, address the conditions in the barn that were making things worse, keep better track of each animal individually, rather than managing the herd as an undifferentiated group. He listened. He didn't interrupt, which she appreciated. When she finished, he was quiet again. Then he said, "People in town are going to say things about you, about how you look and why I..." He stopped. "I know," she said. "I don't want you to think I agree with them." She looked at him carefully. The cold was in his face, making it harder to read, but his gray eyes were doing the same thing they'd done at supper, showing her something before he could catch it. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, "I have been hearing things from people about how I look since I was 11 years old. I've learned something from it, which is that the people saying those things are not going to change, and I am not going to get smaller, and so the only thing left is to decide whether any of it means something I should actually listen to. And? And so far, nobody who said those things has been right about anything important. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he gave a single nod. Not agreement, exactly, more like acknowledgement, the kind of nod that says, I heard you, and I haven't decided yet, but I'm not dismissing it. Come inside, he said. I'll make coffee. She fell into step beside him, and the wind pushed at both of them equally, indifferent to size or history or what anyone in Harlow thought. Over the next 3 days, she worked. Not performing work to prove something, not working strategically to impress him, just working, the way she'd always worked, which was to start from one end and go to the other end and not stop until it was done. She was methodical, she was thorough, and she was significantly more physically capable than anyone who'd seen her step off that stage would have predicted, which was their failure of imagination, not her failure of any kind. She reorganized the barn for better airflow in the ways that mattered and less airflow in the ways that were costing the animals heat. She repaired a feed trough that had a split in it. Not a perfect repair. She didn't have the right materials, but a functional one. She went through the supply situation in the barn and the house both, and made a list, which she handed to Ethan, who looked at it for a long moment. This is a lot, he said. Some of it can wait. The ones with the check marks can't. He folded the list and put it in his coat pocket without argument. She started treating the animals she'd identified, gently, one at a time, going into the stall and sitting with them first, getting them used to her presence before she did anything else. The young steer that she'd found first, she'd named in her head Tuesday because she'd found him on a Tuesday and because naming them made her pay attention better. She didn't tell Ethan that. She didn't think he'd understand it yet. On the third morning, she was in Tuesday's stall when she heard it. Voices outside. More than one. She couldn't make out the words, but she could make out the tone. That particular tone that people used when they were saying something about someone who wasn't supposed to hear it. She stayed where she was. She finished what she was doing with the steer. She ran her hand along his leg again and noted that the swelling was marginally better, which was early, but it was something. Then she heard Ethan's voice, lower, and the other voices again, louder. She came out of the barn. There were 2 men on horseback in the yard. One of them she recognized from the street in Harlow, one of the men who'd been standing with Dillard Creech, though not Creech himself. The other she didn't know, an older man with a heavy dark beard and a coat that was better quality than anything on this property. They were looking at her as she came out. The one she recognized said something to the other, low, and the other man's mouth bent. "Miss," the older man said, with the particular courtesy of a man who is being courteous as a form of condescension. "We were just asking Caldwell how he's getting on with his new arrangement." "My wife," Ethan said flatly. A pause. She hadn't expected that word. Not yet. Not from him. She kept her expression level. "Right," the older man said. He was looking at Mabel the way men looked at things they were assessing for value. "I'm Ray Dunmore. I own the Double D, north of here." He paused. "I've made Caldwell an offer before, on this property. Thought it was worth coming back around to see if he'd reconsidered." Mabel understood several things simultaneously in that moment. She understood that Dunmore was not here to be sociable. She understood that the offer he'd made before was probably not a generous one. She understood that coming back out here now, after the arrival of a mail-order bride that the whole town was laughing about, was a deliberate move, the calculation being that a man humiliated and destabilized might be more willing to sell. She also understood that Ethan's hands, at his sides, had gone still in the way that hands go still when a man is working very hard not to do something with them. "He's not selling," she said. Both men looked at her. "Ma'am," Dunmore said with the same false courtesy. "The ranch isn't for sale," she said. "Thank you for riding out." A long moment. Dunmore looked at Ethan, who said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. Dunmore's expression shifted. Not angry, not yet, something more deliberate and less readable. He gathered his reins. "Caldwell," he said, "think it over. The offer won't stay on the table forever." He turned his horse and the other man followed, and they rode out the way they'd come. Ethan stood where he was for a moment, looking at the gate, not at her. "You shouldn't have," he started. "He came here to see if you'd fold," she said. Did you want to fold? A long pause. No, he said. Then someone needed to say it. He turned to look at her then. Really look at her, in a way that was different from the assessing look he'd had that first afternoon. Not warmth. She wasn't expecting warmth, didn't need it yet, but something that hadn't been there before. The cattle, he said, after a moment. You really think you can help them? It wasn't quite a question. The 4 I started on are already doing better, she said. The breathing one is going to need more time, and I can't promise you anything about him. But yes, I think I can help them. He nodded. He looked at the gate again. He looked at the land, the flat, wide January land. Dunmore's been after this place for 3 years, he said. He wants the water rights. The creek on the south boundary. It's the only reliable year-round water for 4 miles in any direction. She filed that away. It was the kind of detail that mattered, the kind of thing that explained shapes of things she'd only half understood. He's patient, she said. He's patient, Ethan agreed, and he's been watching this place get weaker. Then we'd better stop letting it get weaker, she said. She went back into the barn, back to the work, back to the slow, patient, methodical business of understanding what was wrong before deciding what to do about it. She could feel his eyes on her back as she went, and she thought about Tuesday the steer, whose leg was marginally better on the 3rd day, who had let her touch him this morning without shying, who was not healed but was heading in the right direction. About how most things that got better didn't do it dramatically. About how most real turning points looked, from the inside, like just another morning of work. She picked up the brush and started from where she'd left off. The breathing steer didn't make it through the end of that first week. She found him down on his side in the early morning of the 5th day, his side still moving but barely, and she stayed with him for 2 hours doing what she could, which was less than she wanted it to be. He was gone before the sun got fully up. She stood in the stall for a moment afterward, her hands at her sides, and didn't allow herself more than that moment because there were 11 other animals in the barn that still needed attention, and grief, like everything else, had its time and its place, and this was neither. She told Ethan at breakfast. He absorbed it without visible reaction, which she'd started to understand was not the same thing as feeling nothing. He set his coffee cup down and looked at the table and then said, "That's the 3rd one this month." "I know," she said. "The others are doing better. The 4 I started on first, the leg issue is responding. 1 out of 4 isn't good odds. He was already further along than the others when I found him. If I'd been here 2 weeks ago, it might have been different." She said it plainly, not to wound him and not to excuse herself. He wasn't lost because of something that happened this week. Ethan picked up his cup again and didn't say anything, and the silence sat between them in the way silences had started to sit between them. Not comfortable yet, not easy, but no longer entirely hostile. More like 2 people learning the dimensions of a shared space. She washed the breakfast things and went back out to the barn. By the end of the 2nd week, she had a clearer picture of the ranch's situation, and it was not a good one. The cattle losses over the past year had not been random. They followed a pattern she recognized from Krause's place, a pattern that came from the land itself, from the specific composition of the soil in the lower pasture where the herd spent most of the winter, from the way the water source fed through certain minerals that accumulated in the animals over months. Krause had dealt with it by rotating his grazing in a specific way and supplementing the winter feed with particular things he got from a supplier in Columbus. It had taken him 2 years and a lot of dead cattle to figure it out, and he'd figured it out mostly by accident. Mabel had watched him figure it out. She'd been there for the 2nd year of it, when he started doing things differently and the losses stopped. She didn't have everything she needed. Some of what she needed she couldn't get in Harlow, or not easily. But she knew what she was working with now, which was different from 2 weeks ago, and knowing the shape of a problem was the first real step toward doing something about it. She wrote a list of supplies and showed it to Ethan one evening after supper. He looked at it for a long time, longer than the first list she'd given him. "Some of this I've never heard of," he said. "I know, I can write to a supplier in Cheyenne. They'll have most of it. This number here," he pointed. "That's going to cost—" "I know what it's going to cost," she said. "I did the arithmetic. Against what you lost last year in cattle, it's about a quarter of that." He looked at the number again. She could see him doing the calculation in his head, and she let him do it because it was his money and his decision, and she was not going to push. "The water rights," he said, not looking up from the list. Dunmore. He came back by the fence line yesterday when I was out mending. She hadn't known that. What did he say? Didn't say much. Rode the line for a bit and rode off. Ethan set the list down. That's what he does. Reminds you he's watching. Does he have any legal claim to the water? No, my father filed the water rights in '71. It's documented at the county seat. He paused. But documentation doesn't stop a man with enough money and enough patience. She thought about that, filed it alongside everything else she was building a picture from. Write to the supplier, he said, finally, tapping the list. Tell them I'll pay half on order and half on delivery. She nodded. She took the list back. You didn't argue, she said, not quite a question. He looked at her. About what? The cost. Last week you pushed back on $1.20 in nails. He was quiet for a moment. Something moved in his expression that she couldn't quite name. Last week I didn't know whether any of this was going to work, he said. Tuesday's leg is almost right. Those two you found in the south pasture are moving better. You said it yourself. You know what you're looking at now. It was, she thought, the closest thing to a compliment he'd given her. She didn't make anything of it. I'll write the letter tonight, she said. The letter she wrote to Harlow's general store the same afternoon, asking to add the items she could source locally to Ethan's account. She sealed it and set it aside to go into town with the next supply run. She was blotting the second letter, the one to Cheyenne, when she heard the sound outside. Not wind. She'd learned the vocabulary of this place's wind in 2 weeks, its different registers and what each one meant. This was something moving in the yard. Horses, more than one. She went to the window. 3 riders. Not Dunmore this time. 2 she didn't recognize, younger men, and between them a woman on a good horse, good enough horse that Mabel noted it. The woman was perhaps 40, thin in the manner of someone who controlled themselves carefully, dressed in a coat that had not come from any store in Harlow. Ethan came in from the back while she was still watching. Who is that? She asked. He looked past her out the window, and something shifted in his face. Clara Dunmore, he said. Ray's wife. Mabel looked at the woman again. She comes out here? First time. He said it quietly, but she heard something under the quiet, something that was not quite alarm and not quite resignation. Closer to the feeling a person gets when a pattern they've been watching shifts unexpectedly. I'll put the coffee on, Mabel said. He looked at her. We're not going to make her stand in the yard, Mabel said. Whatever she came for. Clara. Dunmore came in with the practiced ease of a woman who had spent a lifetime entering other women's spaces and assessing them. She looked at the kitchen, at the supplies on the shelf, at the fire, and at Mabel, and her expression throughout remained pleasant in a way that meant nothing. Mrs. Caldwell, she said, I hope I'm not intruding. You're not, Mabel said, which was technically true and contextually complicated. She poured coffee and set it out and sat down, because she was not going to stand in her own kitchen. Clara sat across from her. Ethan remained near the door, which Mabel noted. He was letting her manage this, or he didn't know how to, and she wasn't yet sure which. I wanted to welcome you, Clara said. I should have come sooner. The weather's been keeping everyone close to home. It has, Mabel agreed. Ray mentioned he'd stopped by. She stirred her coffee slowly, watching her own hand. He worries about his neighbors. He's a very community-minded man. Mabel thought about Dunmore riding the fence line, about the way Ethan had said he reminds you he's watching. That's kind of him, she said. A small pause. Clara looked up from her coffee and looked at Mabel directly for the first time, and the pleasantness in her expression was still there, but there was something else underneath it, an intelligence, a calculation, and under both of those, something less readable. Not quite sympathy, not quite its opposite. It's not an easy life out here, Clara said. For a woman who's new to it. I'm finding my footing, Mabel said. Ray did say, a small pause, that the ranch has had a hard year. Most ranches have had a hard year, Mabel said. It's been a hard winter. Of course. The stirring, slow and deliberate. He just worries. If things got much harder for Ethan, it might make more sense to simplify. The word landed with the specific weight of a word that had been chosen carefully. Mabel looked at the woman across from her. She looked at her for long enough that Clara's eyes moved to her coffee cup. Mrs. Dunmore, Mabel said, I appreciate you coming out. The coffee's there if you'd like more. Clara looked up. The ranch is not going to simplify, Mabel said. We're coming out of a hard season and going into a better one. I think your husband probably already knows that, or will soon. She said it without heat, the same way she said everything, plainly, as a statement of fact. But it was kind of you to make the ride. A silence. Ethan, near the door, was very still. Clara Dunmore set her cup down. She looked at Mabel with the pleasant expression entirely gone now, replaced by something more straightforward that Mabel actually found easier to read. You're not what I expected, Clara said. I imagine not, Mabel said. Clara stood. She nodded to Ethan, then looked at Mabel once more. A longer look, harder to decode than anything that had come before it, and then she went out. Ethan came to the table after a moment and sat down in the chair Clara had vacated. She came to see if you'd break, he said. I know. Did she find out? Mabel picked up Clara Dunmore's cup and set it in the wash basin. What do you think? He was quiet for a moment. I think she found out something she wasn't expecting. That's usually more valuable than breaking, Mabel said. The supplies from Cheyenne took 11 days. In those 11 days, she learned the ranch from the inside out. Not the daily routine of it, which she'd already absorbed, but the deeper history, the way the land had been worked and what that working had cost it. She walked the pasture lines in the mornings after the barn work was done, sometimes with Ethan and sometimes alone, reading the ground the way Krause had taught her, the way the grass came up in certain places and didn't in others, the way the soil held water in the lower sections until it became something that wasn't nourishment anymore. She found the South Boundary Creek on the 8th day, following it to the property line on her own while Ethan was in town. She stood at the boundary fence and looked at the water moving under a thin skim of ice, still running despite the cold, clear where it came in from the north, and slightly discolored where it moved through the lower section of Dunmore's adjoining land. She looked at that discoloration for a long time. She had no tools with her. She had her hands and her eyes and what Krause had put in her head. She crouched down at the bank and broke the surface ice carefully and looked at the silt on the bottom and smelled the water. An old farmer's test, crude and not scientific, but useful. She stood up and looked at Dunmore's land on the other side of the fence. She thought about the cattle losses. She thought about the pattern she'd identified, the accumulated mineral content, the way it had affected specific animals over specific months. She thought about where those animals had watered. She filed it carefully in the back of her mind alongside everything else, because she didn't have proof, and she wouldn't say anything without proof. And because accusation without evidence in a place like this was a way of starting a war you couldn't win. She walked back to the ranch and said nothing. The supplies arrived on a Tuesday. She noticed the coincidence and thought of the steer, on a wagon from the Cheyenne freight line, driven by a man who complained about the road the entire time he was unloading. She checked every item against her list while Ethan paid the driver. Most of it was there. 2 things weren't, substituted without notice for something cheaper that wouldn't work the same way, which meant a second order, which meant more time. She didn't show her frustration to Ethan. She separated out what she had and started with what she could start with, and added the second order to the letter she'd already prepared for Cheyenne, and sent it with the complaint about the substitutions written in the careful, specific language she'd learned was more effective than anger. The next morning, she started the real work. It was harder than explaining it had been. Changing the supplement protocol for 41 animals one at a time, adjusting the grazing rotation with the ground still frozen and the south pasture largely unavailable, rebuilding certain habits in the animals that had been established over years. None of it moved quickly, and some of it moved backward before it moved forward. An animal she'd thought was improving had a bad 2 days that undid a week's work. A section of fence she needed moved turned out to have a post so rotted that pulling it opened a gap that let 2 animals into the wrong pasture, and getting them back cost most of an afternoon. Ethan helped without being asked, once he understood what she was trying to do, which was its own kind of thing. He was not a man who took direction easily. She'd understood that from the first morning in the barn. The stiffening, the slight resistance, the way he moved when she made a suggestion that conflicted with what he'd been doing. He wasn't stupid and he wasn't willfully difficult. He had spent years doing things a certain way, and the certain way had gotten him through those years. And it took something to put down what you knew and try something unfamiliar. She didn't push. She didn't explain more than she needed to. When he pushed back, which he did about the grazing rotation in particular, she stopped and listened and didn't interrupt. And then she said what she needed to say without repeating herself, and let him sit with it. 3 days later, he moved the rotation the way she'd asked. He didn't say anything about it. He just did it. And she didn't say anything about it either, just registered it and moved on. Dillard Creech came out on a Thursday with another man, a small, nervous-looking person he introduced as his cousin from Laramie. She was replacing a section of trough lining when they rode in, and she kept working while Ethan spoke with them. She could hear the conversation from where she was. Not every word, but enough. Creech was the kind of man who spoke at a volume designed to carry, whether he was aware of it or not. Heard you got the old girl working the barn. And then something lower she didn't catch, and then laughter from the cousin. She pressed the trough lining into place and hammered it down and didn't stop what she was doing. Ethan's voice, lower and less carrying, something she couldn't make out. Creech again. No offense meant, Caldwell, but you've got to admit. And more laughter. She finished the trough section. She stood up. She picked up the hammer and the tin of nails and walked past Creech and his cousin toward the barn. "Ma'am," Creech said, with the same false courtesy Dunmore had used. "Mr. Creech," she said without stopping. "That trough work?" he said, surprised enough by her knowing his name that he said something real instead of something performative. She stopped and looked at him. "Not yet. Give it a day." He looked at her for a moment, really looked at her, not the display look people had been giving her since Harlow, something slightly recalibrated. He said. She went into the barn. She stood in the dim, warm, animal-scented interior for a moment and let herself feel the anger she'd been carrying, which was real and had weight and deserved acknowledgement in private even if she wouldn't show it in public. Then she set it down. Not put it away, because she'd learned that put-away anger had a way of coming out sideways, but set it aside like a tool she wasn't using right this minute, available when she needed it. She went back to work. The night the temperature dropped to something she had no adequate reference point for, the coldest it had been since she'd arrived, cold enough that the air hurt to breathe, and the door to the barn had to be worked free of the ice that formed around its edge. She stayed up past midnight checking on the animals. Ethan found her there at 11, or she found him, because they'd both had the same thought at the same time and met in the dark barn doorway coming from opposite directions. They both stopped. "I was going to check the water troughs," she said. "So was I," he said. A pause. The cold was extraordinary, physical and absolute. "I'll take the inside troughs," she said. "You take the outside." He nodded and went past her, and she went in. It took an hour. The inside troughs were fine, insulated enough by the barn walls, but she checked each animal anyway, one at a time, running her hand along flanks and checking breathing and looking at eyes in the lantern light. Tuesday's leg, fully sound now, the animal shifting over to make room for her in the stall with a familiarity she found quietly satisfying. The four she'd first identified were indistinguishable from the healthy animals now. The two from the south pasture still had a little way to go, but were moving right. Ethan came back in as she was finishing the last stall. "Troughs are clear," he said. "I packed some straw around the base of the east one." "Good," she said. She came out of the last stall. "The animals are all right." He was carrying his lantern and standing in the aisle between the stalls, and the lantern light was doing something complicated to the shadows on his face. He looked like what he was, a man who'd been fighting this place for years and was somewhere between exhausted and something else she didn't have a name for yet. "You didn't have to stay up," he said. "Neither did you." "It's my ranch." "I know," she said. "It's also my home." He looked at her. The word had come out more plainly than she'd intended, without the careful neutrality she usually maintained, and she wasn't sure whether that was a mistake or just honesty. "Yes," he said after a moment. "It is." They walked back to the house through the extraordinary cold, not quite together and not quite separate, the snow squeaking under their boots, the stars overhead absolutely clear in the way they only got clear when it was cold enough to be dangerous, the kind of sky that made you feel very small and very awake at the same time. She made 2 cups of coffee because there was no point trying to sleep yet, and she was cold to her bones, and they sat at opposite ends of the long table and drank them. "My father built this place in 1863, Ethan said, not looking at her. He came out from Illinois with my mother and $120 and a letter of credit that turned out to be worth about 40 of it. She didn't say anything. She'd learned he talked differently in the late hours, with less of the controlled surface. He always said the land would do right by you if you did right by it. A pause. I've been wondering for about 3 years now what I was doing wrong. You weren't doing wrong, she said. You just didn't know what you were looking at. He looked at her then. Neither did he for a while, she said. Krause. He lost 18 head in 2 years before he figured out what was happening. And he'd been working cattle for 20 years by that point. It wasn't stupidity. It was information he didn't have. He figured it out, Ethan said. He had help, she said. He just didn't know it was help at the time. A pause. He looked at her with the gray eyes doing the thing they did. What do you mean? I used to bring him things, she said. Things I'd noticed. Questions I had. He thought he was instructing me, but I was also pushing him in certain directions without him realizing it, because I'd read something or noticed something and I wanted to see if it worked. She looked at her coffee cup. Old men don't always receive suggestions well, but if they think it's their idea, they'll try almost anything. A silence. She heard him process this and waited. That's, he started. Practical, she said. He gave a sound that was not quite a laugh. The first one she'd heard from him. It was short and reluctant, and it was real. Is that what you're doing with me? He said. Letting me think things are my idea? She looked at him across the long table. Not yet, she said. You're smarter than Krause. He did laugh then, a proper one, brief but genuine, surprised out of him. She felt something small and careful shift in the room. The grazing rotation, he said. It was the right call. You made it. After you explained it 4 times. 3, she said. I wasn't sure it was going to work on the 3rd one either. He shook his head slightly, looking at the table, and the shadow of the laugh was still in his face. Mabel, he said. It was the first time he'd used her name. She waited. He stopped. Tried again. I should have said something in Harlow. When Creech, you don't owe me an apology for other men's behavior, she said. I owe you something, he said. For not... He moved his hand, a gesture she couldn't fully decode. For not defending me, she said plainly. He met her eyes. Yes. She considered this. Outside, the cold pressed on the house with its extraordinary intentional weight. Then do it next time, she said. That's what I'd rather have. He nodded. Once, like he had in the yard that first day, but different now. Not the nod of a man acknowledging something he was still deciding about. Something more settled. She finished her coffee. She stood up and set the cup in the basin. Get some sleep, she said. The trough is going to need checking again before 4. I know, he said. She went to her room. She sat on the edge of the cot in the dark and held the conversation in her mind for a moment. Not the warmth of it, exactly, because warmth was too simple a word. More like the texture of it. The way things that had been one shape between them had shifted into a slightly different shape, not resolved and not simple, but pointing somewhere. She lay down and listened to the cold. She thought about Dunmore riding the fence line, about the water, about what she'd seen and what she still needed to understand. She thought about the 11 days until spring would technically begin, which meant approximately nothing out here, where spring arrived when it arrived, and not a moment sooner. She thought about 40 cattle that were, on balance, in better shape than they'd been a month ago. Not saved, not yet, but better. She closed her eyes. Outside, the extraordinary cold stars wheeled over Wyoming in their old indifferent paths, and the ranch held against the dark the way things held when they had enough reason to. And the woman in the back room who had arrived with a worn suitcase and a mind full of things nobody had thought to look for lay still and made plans until she finally slept. Spring in Wyoming did not arrive so much as it negotiated. It came in pieces. A morning that was almost warm followed by 3 days that were emphatically not. A week where the snow pulled back from the south-facing slopes and then returned to cover what it had uncovered, as if it hadn't made up its mind yet and resented being rushed. Mabel had learned to stop expecting it and start working with what any given day actually offered, which was a more useful relationship with the season than the one she'd arrived with. The cattle were different animals than they'd been in January. Not all of them. She wasn't going to pretend the work had been without losses, because it had. 2 more animals had gone in February, one to something she couldn't fully diagnose, and one to an injury that happened in the night and was too far along by the time she found it. She'd sat with that second one the way she'd sat with the breathing steer in January, doing what she could with what she had, which wasn't enough. She'd gotten better at carrying that particular weight. Not lighter, but better distributed. But the 37 animals that remained were, on any honest accounting, in better condition than they'd been when she arrived. The 4 she'd identified in the first week moved freely, ate well, and showed none of the signs she'd been watching for. The rotation she'd established was holding. The supplement protocol from Cheyenne had done what she'd expected it to do. Ethan had stopped questioning it somewhere around the 6th week, not with any announcement, but simply by doing it without the slight resistance he'd had at the start, and she'd registered that shift without comment. The way you register the moment a door that's been sticking finally opens cleanly. What she hadn't solved was the water. She'd gone back to the South Boundary Creek twice since January, both times alone, both times looking at what she'd seen the first time and confirming that she was seeing it correctly. The discoloration in the water where it came through Dunmore's land was not dramatic. You could miss it easily if you weren't looking, and most people who came to the creek weren't looking for that particular thing. But it was consistent, and it was upstream of where Ethan's cattle had been watering, and the pattern of sickness she'd identified in the herd tracked with the animals that had used that section of the creek most. She needed proof. Not suspicion, not pattern, documented, demonstrable proof. She didn't know exactly what that looked like yet, but she knew she didn't have it, and that moving without it would be worse than not moving at all. She was thinking about this on a morning in late March when Ethan came in from the east pasture with a look she'd learned to read. Not the controlled surface he kept up around other people, but the version underneath it that he'd stopped maintaining around her somewhere in the middle of February. "Come look at something," he said. The east pasture held 12 animals. She stood at the fence with Ethan and looked at what he'd seen, and her stomach dropped in the quiet way that bad news landed when you'd been half expecting it. 3 of the 12 were showing signs she recognized. Not the leg issue, something different, faster moving, from what she could see at distance. 2 of them were standing apart from the group, which was itself a signal. The third was still in the group but carrying itself wrong, head slightly low, moving with a reluctance that didn't match the temperature. "When did you notice?" she said. "This morning. Though looking at them now, maybe yesterday, for those 2. She went into the pasture. She worked through the 3 animals carefully, and what she found when she was close was worse than the distance view. The 2 standing apart had a fever she could feel without a thermometer, their skin hot under her hands, even through their coats. Their eyes had the particular quality she'd seen before in animals that had crossed from sick into something more serious, a kind of withdrawal, as if they were already somewhere else. The third animal was earlier. She pressed her thumb in specific places and noted where he flinched. She looked at his eyes and his coat and the quality of his breathing. She came back out of the pasture. "The 2 apart are in real trouble," she said. "The third one I might be able to pull back if I start today." "What is it?" "Something in the water," she said. It came out before she'd decided to say it. "I've been watching the creek, the south section. I think something's coming through from Dunmore's land." Ethan was very still. "I don't have proof," she said immediately. "I want to be clear about that. I have what I've observed and what I know from before, and the pattern fits, but I can't prove it in any way that would matter." "Yet," he said. She looked at him. "Yet." The word landed between them with its full weight. "The 2 that are bad," he said. "What do you need?" She told him. It was a longer list this time, and 2 of the things on it she wasn't sure she could get in Harlow. She told him that too. "I'll write in this morning," he said. "The things you can't get there. Write to Cheyenne again. Mark it urgent. They'll send it on the fast freight if you pay the extra." He nodded and went inside to write the letter. She went back into the pasture and started with what she had. The next 8 days were the hardest stretch since she'd arrived. The 2 animals in serious trouble required attention she could only give them by being present, not constantly, but regularly, through the night as well as the day, checking, adjusting, doing the small interventions that individually seemed trivial and collectively might add up to something. She slept in pieces. She woke at 2 in the morning and went to the barn and came back and lay down for 2 more hours and went back again. She lost track of days by the fourth night and started keeping a written log on a piece of paper pinned to the barn wall. Times, temperatures she estimated with her hands, feed taken or refused, changes she observed. Ethan did what she asked without being asked twice, which she was more grateful for than she showed. He took the night checks when she forced herself to sleep more than 2 hours, and she didn't have to tell him how to do them because she'd already told him what to look for, and he'd retained it, and she found his notes on the paper when she came back at 2 in the morning. Small, precise handwriting, methodical, more detailed than she'd expected. She didn't lose either of the 2 serious animals. She almost lost one of them. On the 5th night, she sat on the barn floor next to a stall for 3 hours doing something that was mostly just keeping the animal calm and present because she'd done everything she could do, and the rest of it was the animal's own work. She talked to it. She was past the point of caring how that looked, in a low, steady voice about nothing in particular, about the ranch and the spring and what the east pasture was going to look like in May. She was aware, at some level, that she was talking to herself as much as to the animal, keeping both of them grounded. Ethan found her there at midnight and didn't say anything, just came in and sat down on the other side of the stall and stayed. They sat on opposite sides of a sick animal in a cold barn in the middle of the night and didn't talk. And something about the silence was different from the earlier silences between them. Less empty, more like 2 people choosing to be in the same place. The animal made it to morning. By the 8th day, the 3rd animal, the one she'd caught early, was visibly better. One of the 2 serious ones was moving around the stall in a way that meant something was working. The second was stable, which was the best she could honestly say. The supplies from Cheyenne arrived on the 9th day. She used what she needed and held the rest in reserve, which she hadn't done before with the Cheyenne orders, and she registered in a quiet part of her mind what that meant, that she was thinking about what came next, not just what was in front of her. On the 10th day, she went back to the South Boundary Creek with a glass jar she'd boiled clean. She filled it from 2 places, one from where the water came in from Dunmore's land and one from the clear section upstream of that. She sealed them both with wax and labeled them with a strip of cloth tied around each, and a mark she'd understand, and then she rode into Harlow and went to the office of the only man in town she'd heard mentioned as having any claim to scientific knowledge, which was the doctor. His name was Aldous Ferris, and he was not what she'd expected, which was itself something she'd started to notice about herself. That her expectations of this place were consistently wrong in ways that instructed her. He was perhaps 60, heavy-set in a way that suggested he'd given up fighting it some years ago, with eyeglasses that had been repaired with wire and a coat that had more pockets than seemed necessary. He looked at her when she came in with the 2 sealed jars without the expression she'd been getting in Harlow since January. He looked at her the way people look at something they're actually curious about. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said. He'd heard of her. Everyone in Harlow had heard of her. But he said her name without weight on it, just a name. "Dr. Ferris." She set the jars on his desk. "I need someone who can look at water samples and tell me what's in them." He looked at the jars. He picked one up and held it to the light. "I'm not a chemist," he said. "I know. Do you know enough to tell me if something is wrong with this?" He looked at her over his repaired glasses. "Where are these from?" "My property and the property adjacent to mine. I can tell you more once I know what you find." A pause. He set the jar down. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said, "are you asking me to look at this informally, or are you asking me to document what I find?" She'd thought about this on the ride in. She'd thought about Dunmore patient and watchful on the fence line, about Clara Dunmore's pleasant expression and the calculation underneath it, about water rights documented in 1871 at the county seat, and what it took to undermine something documented. "I need it documented," she said. Ferris looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up both jars and took them to the window. "Come back on Thursday," he said. "I'll have something for you." She did not tell Ethan where she'd been. Not because she was keeping it from him. She'd moved past that kind of withholding somewhere in the barn nights of the past 10 days. She didn't tell him because she didn't want to give him something to respond to until she had something real. He had enough to carry without the weight of a suspicion she couldn't yet prove. Instead, she told him about the east pasture animals, which were improving in a way she could demonstrate, and about the rotation adjustment she wanted to make for April, and about the fence section on the north line that had gone from needing attention to needing immediate attention. He listened. He argued about the rotation, Not the direction of the argument, but the degree, a smaller resistance than he would have had in January. And she let him make his case, and then made hers again, and they landed on a version that was closer to what she'd originally said than to what he'd pushed back with. And he knew it, and she knew it, and neither of them made anything of it. That night over supper, she said, "You mentioned your father filed the water rights in '71. Do you have the documentation here, or is it only at the county seat?" He looked at her. She saw the register of the question, saw him note that it wasn't a casual question. "County seat," he said. "I have a letter from the county clerk from when I renewed the registration in '82. Why?" "I'd like to see it when you have a chance." A pause. "Mabel, I don't have anything solid yet," she said. "When I do, I'll tell you everything." He looked at her for long enough that she thought he was going to push. Then he looked at his plate. "The letter's in the box under the desk," he said, "the wooden one with the broken clasp." "Thank you," she said. She found it that evening and read it carefully in the lantern light. The letter from the county clerk was dated March of 1882, confirming the water rights registration to one Harlan Caldwell, transferred by an James Caldwell, covering the South Boundary Creek and its tributary as it crossed the northeastern property line, all the way to the survey marker placed in 1871. She read it twice. She folded it carefully and put it back in the box with the broken clasp, and thought about Dunmore, who had been patient for 3 years, and about what patience was actually in service of. Thursday came. Ferris had set up his findings on the desk when she arrived, 2 pieces of paper, the jars sitting alongside them, and a professional gravity in his expression that told her something before he said a word. "I'm not equipped to identify specific compounds," he said, "and I want to be clear about the limits of what I can tell you. But this sample," he pointed to the jar she'd marked with 2 cloth ties, "has a sediment content and a particular quality I've seen before in water that runs through certain kinds of industrial runoff or chemical treatment processes." She was very still. "The upstream sample," he said, pointing to the single-tied jar, "is clean, unremarkable well water." He looked at her. "The downstream sample is not the same water." "Could it be natural?" she said. "Mineral content, something in the soil?" "Natural mineral content doesn't account for what I'm seeing in the sediment. I've looked at a lot of creek water in this territory, Mrs. Caldwell. This has been altered by something upstream." She looked at the 2 jars on his desk. "Will you put that in writing?" she said. He looked at her steadily. "Is this going to cause trouble?" "It might," she said. A pause. "The kind of trouble that needs a doctor, or the kind that needs a lawyer?" "I'm hoping the kind that only needs a lawyer," she said. He looked at the samples again, and she could see him doing the same kind of calculation she'd been doing. What it cost to say something and what it cost to stay quiet, and which cost was the one he could live with. "I know a man in Cheyenne," he said finally. "Harold Webb. He handles land disputes. He's the kind of lawyer who likes this kind of problem." He looked at her. "He's not cheap." "Tell me how to reach him," she said. She rode back to the ranch with Ferris's written assessment in her coat and the name Harold Webb in her mind, and something that was not quite relief and not quite fear. Something between them, the particular feeling of a thing that has been formless, taking on a shape you can finally put your hands on. She told Ethan that evening. All of it, the creek, the jars, Ferris, the written assessment, the name of the lawyer in Cheyenne. She laid it out in sequence without dramatizing it, the way she laid out everything, and she watched his face while she talked. He was not a man whose face moved much when he was absorbing something serious. He sat with his hands flat on the table and his gray eyes doing their steady work, and he didn't interrupt her once, which was itself significant because he was a man who usually had something to say. When she finished, the silence lasted longer than any silence they'd had in the weeks of late-night conversations and early mornings and barn emergencies. Then he said, "He's been running something through the water deliberately." "I don't know that," she said carefully. "What I know is that the water changes character after it crosses his land, and that the pattern of sickness in our herd matches water exposure. Ferris can confirm the first. The second," she paused, "the second is inference." "It's more than inference," he said. His voice had a quality she hadn't heard before, quieter than anger, which was usually a worse sign. "It might be," she said, "but inference doesn't win in front of a county judge. Documentation does." He looked at his hands on the table. "My father would have ridden over there," he said. I know, she said. And then what? A long pause. Dunmore would have had the sheriff out before your father got back in the saddle, she said. A man with his money and his connections. Physical confrontation is the best outcome he could hope for from you. It gives him something to work with. So we write letters, he said, and there was an edge in it she understood was not directed at her. We write letters, she said, and we get the documentation in order, and we take it to Webb in Cheyenne. And we do this in a way that he cannot answer with money or patience because the record is already made. He looked at her across the table. His eyes had the quality she'd come to recognize as him being most honest, when the controlled surface was thin enough to see through. What made you look at the creek? He said. She thought about January, about standing at the south boundary in the cold, smelling the water, looking at the discoloration, filing it in the back of her mind where she kept the things she needed to understand before she could use. Something Krause said, she said, about the land telling you what it needs. He meant it one way, but I always took it to mean the land tells you what's wrong with it too, if you watch instead of just use it. Ethan was quiet for a moment. He sounds like he was a good man. He was a difficult man, she said. Good ones often are. Something moved in Ethan's expression. Recognition, she thought. He sat back. Write to Webb, he said. I'll pay whatever he asks. Half now, half on results, she said. That's how it should be structured. It keeps him working. He looked at her with the expression she'd come to think of as his recalibrating look, the one that was not quite surprise anymore, something more settled than that. You dealt with lawyers before. I've dealt with people who thought they had more power than me before, she said. The approach is similar. Why? The letter went to Cheyenne on Friday. Webb's response came back in 8 days, which was faster than she'd expected, and it was 3 pages long and specific and had the tone of a man who had found something interesting. He'd already made inquiries. The water rights registration for the South Boundary Creek was clean and clear and senior to anything Dunmore had filed, which meant Dunmore's play, if he was making one, was not frontal. But Webb had found something else, a land survey discrepancy filed in 1879, a quiet adjustment to the boundary line on the northeast section that didn't match the 1871 survey markers. The adjustment was small, less than 40 feet, but it moved the legal ownership of a strip of ground that happened to include the section of creek bank where the water changed character. She read this 3 times. She went and found Ethan. She showed him Webb's letter. He read it. She watched his face. He moved the boundary, Ethan said. He said it very quietly. Or had it moved, she said. Webb doesn't know yet who filed the adjustment. He's looking into it. In 79, He stopped. My father was already sick in 79. We weren't paying attention to boundary filings. That's when you do it, she said. When people aren't paying attention. He set the letter down on the table. He's owned that strip of bank for 7 years, he said. Legal or not? It may not be legal, she said. That's what Webb is trying to establish. A boundary adjustment that doesn't reference the original survey markers and wasn't filed with the proper notice. There are grounds to contest it. If we contest it, he'll know we know. He already suspects we know something, she said. Clara's visit wasn't social, and when those animals got sick last month, he'd have been watching to see what we did about it. Ethan was quiet. We've been moving faster than he expected, she said. He thought this place would be in his hands by spring. It isn't. Because of you, he said. She shook her head. Because of what you had here to begin with. The water rights your father filed, the land itself, the cattle that are still on their feet. I didn't make any of that. I just helped you see it. He looked at her for a long moment. Write back to Webb, he said. Tell him to contest the survey adjustment, whatever it takes. She nodded and pulled the paper toward her. Mabel, he said. She looked up. When I went into town last week, Creech said something to me. About you. He paused. About what he called a woman like you thinking she could run a ranch. She waited. I told him he could keep his opinions on my property to himself, or he could keep off my property entirely, he said. And that if he said anything like that about my wife again in my hearing, the second option would become permanent. The word sat there. Wife. He'd said it in the yard the day Clara Dunmore came to. Quickly, to make a point. This was different. This was something he'd said when she wasn't present, to a man who'd been unkind, in a moment when nobody was watching how he looked. She picked up the pen. "Good," she said. She began to write. Outside, the March light was thinning toward evening, coming in low and almost warm through the window, catching the dust above the desk, making it briefly visible before it settled again. The ranch was quieter than it had been in weeks. The East pasture animals were improving. The letter going to Cheyenne would take 8 days each way, and then longer for Webb to do what needed doing. And in the meantime, there was the fence on the north line and the rotation to adjust for April and 37 cattle that still needed daily attention. It was a lot of work for two imperfect people who had arrived at this table from completely different directions and hadn't yet figured out everything they were to each other. But the letter was getting written. The documentation was being made. The thing that had been formless was taking shape, and shape was something you could work with. Mabel wrote until the light gave out, and then she lit the lantern and kept writing. Webb's second letter arrived on a Wednesday in early April, and Mabel read it standing at the desk before she'd taken her coat off. He had found the man who filed the boundary adjustment, not Dunmore himself. Dunmore was too careful for that. A land surveyor named Pell, out of Cheyenne, who had filed 6 boundary adjustments across 3 counties between 1877 and 1882, 4 of which had been subsequently challenged, and 2 of which had been quietly reversed. Webb had spoken with a clerk at the county land office who had processed 2 of Pell's filings, and who was, in Webb's careful language, willing to speak further under the right circumstances. Webb wanted to know how far Ethan wanted to take this before he proceeded. Mabel set the letter down and stood at the desk for a moment, looking at nothing in particular. She was not naive about what how far meant. It meant money, first, Webb's fees, which were already substantial and would grow with each step. It meant time, which was its own cost, measured in the months when the ranch had to keep functioning while the legal work ground through its slow process. It meant exposure, the moment when Dunmore would know with certainty that they were not simply surviving but actively pushing back, and whatever that changed in how he operated. And it meant the clerk in the land office, who was willing to speak further, which was another way of saying the clerk had not yet decided what speaking further was going to cost him, or what protection he'd need, and that was a fragile thing that could go wrong in a dozen ways before it went right. She heard Ethan come in from the east pasture and waited for him at the desk. He read the letter twice, the same way she had. "Pell," he said. "Webb knows him, or knows of him. That's useful." "And the clerk?" "The clerk is the important one," she said. "If the clerk will testify to irregularities in the filing process, that's not just a boundary dispute anymore. That's documented fraud." Ethan set the letter down. He looked at the wall behind the desk, not at her. "If we push this to that point," he said, "Dunmore doesn't just lose the strip of bank. He loses face in front of every rancher in the territory." "Yes," she said. "Men like Dunmore don't absorb that quietly." "No," she said. "They don't." He turned to look at her then. "You've thought about what he might do." "I've thought about it," she said. "I don't think he'll move against us physically. He's too careful, and he's got too much to lose from that kind of attention. But there are other things he can do." She paused. "He can make it harder for us to do business in Harlow. He can call in any obligations people in town owe him, and someone always owes a man like that something. He can make the next buyer we need to sell cattle to unavailable, or the next supplier we need suddenly backlogged. He can make things slow and difficult," Ethan said. "He's been doing that already," she said. "The difference is we'd know it was deliberate instead of guessing." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "What do you want to do?" he said. She looked at him. He'd asked it straightforwardly, without the particular male formulation she'd heard before. The version that asked the question while making clear what the expected answer was. He was actually asking. "I want to write Webb and tell him to talk to the clerk," she said. "I want documentation of the fraudulent filing, and I want to take everything we have to the county judge before Dunmore knows we're moving. That's aggressive." "He's been patient for 3 years," she said. "Patient gave him the strip of bank. I'd rather be aggressive." Another pause, shorter than the first. "Write the letter," he said. April moved the way. Wyoming. April moved, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, the ground alternately frozen and thawed and frozen again. The cattle navigating it with the resigned pragmatism of animals that had survived enough seasons to know complaining changed nothing. The east pasture animals were fully recovered. All three of them, the two serious ones and the one she'd caught early, were indistinguishable now from the rest of the herd, eating well, moving freely, growing into the spring grass that was coming up in the sections she'd rotated them to. She checked them daily out of habit and found less and less to be concerned about, which was a particular kind of satisfaction she'd learned to receive quietly, without announcement. She'd shifted their watering away from the South Boundary Creek in February, when she'd first started to suspect, and kept them shifted since. It had required hauling water in the coldest stretch, which was exhausting work that Ethan had done without complaint after she explained why. Now, with the ground softening, she'd worked with him to open a second water source from the northwest, a smaller flow that had been there all along but underused, clear, upstream of anyone's land, requiring some work to make accessible but yielding clean water once they did. The South Boundary Creek she hadn't touched since she took the samples. She checked it periodically, at distance, noting that the discoloration persisted through March, and was, if anything, slightly more pronounced in April. She'd noted the dates and the observations in the same log she kept for the cattle, in the same careful handwriting, dated and signed. She understood, in a way she couldn't have articulated to anyone who hadn't watched Kraus do his work for 2 years, that documentation was its own form of preparation. You wrote things down, not because you were certain you'd need them, but because certainty was a luxury and preparation was not. Dillard Creech came back in the second week of April with a purpose that was different from his earlier visits. She was working on the north fence line when she saw him come through the gate, and she noted that this time he came alone and moved with less of the loose sociability he'd had before. She set down the wire tensioner and waited. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said. "Mr. Creech." She looked at him. He was a big man, broad through the shoulders, with a face that had spent its whole life outdoors and showed it. In January, she'd read him as a bully with a crowd to perform for. Alone, he read differently. Not kind, not simple, but less confident than his volume suggested. "Ethan around?" he said. "He's in the south pasture. You can ride down or I can give him a message." Creech looked at the fence line. He looked at the work she'd been doing, and she saw him register it. The stretched wire, the replaced post, the section she'd reinforced, before he looked back at her. "I heard something," he said, "about Dunmore, about a lawyer in Cheyenne asking questions at the land office." She kept her expression exactly where it was. "I wouldn't know about that." "People talk," he said. "In Harlow. Somebody's cousin works at the land office and somebody's cousin talks." "People do talk," she agreed. He looked at her steadily. She looked back. "Dunmore's not a man who takes things sitting down," he said. It was almost a warning. She couldn't tell yet if the almost was important. "I imagine he's not," she said. "He's got obligations from half the businessmen in Harlow." He paused. "And the sheriff's brother-in-law owes him a significant sum." She absorbed this. It was useful information, and the fact that Creech was giving it to her instead of to Dunmore was interesting. "Why are you telling me this?" she said. He looked away at the pasture. He was quiet for a moment, and in that moment she recalibrated him again. This man who had called her a barn, who had made a crowd laugh, who had said the things people said about women like her in public spaces in front of the person they were said about. "I grew up 2 miles from this place," he said. "I knew Ethan's father." She waited. "Harlan Caldwell was the straightest man in this county," he said. "He'd give you anything he had if you needed it, and you'd earned it. And he wouldn't give you a cent if you hadn't, and everybody knew which side of that line they were on." He paused again. "Dunmore's been trying to take pieces of this land since before Harlan died. Harlan wouldn't sell, and Dunmore couldn't make him." "And after Harlan died," she said. "Things got harder for Ethan," Creech said, "and Dunmore got patient." "Yes," she said. "He did." A silence. The wind moved across the pasture, cool and direct. "If something were to happen," Creech said carefully, "in terms of people with knowledge of how things were done at the land office being willing to say what they know in front of the right people, the sheriff's brother-in-law's debt to Dunmore is one thing. What the rest of Harlow thinks of a man who poisons his neighbor's creek is another thing." She looked at him. "I'm not saying anything formally," he said. "I'm just saying that Dunmore has obligations from people, but people also have opinions, and those two things don't always run the same direction." "No," she said slowly. "They don't." He nodded. He looked at the fence line once more, the work she'd been doing. That's good work, he said, with the tone of someone saying it because it was true rather than because he wanted to. He turned his horse and rode back out the way he'd come. She stood at the fence line for a moment after he left, holding the wire tensioner in her hand, thinking about what he'd said and what he hadn't said, and what the difference between the two meant. Then she picked up where she'd left off. She told Ethan about Creech's visit that evening. He listened with the particular quality of attention he'd developed for things she brought him. Not passive, but specifically not interrupting, which she'd come to understand was something he'd had to learn, and had learned because he'd decided it was worth learning. When she finished, he said, "He came to tell you the sheriff is compromised." "Partially," she said. "He also came to tell me that Dunmore's support in town is not as solid as Dunmore probably thinks." "Creech isn't a generous man," Ethan said. "He doesn't give information without reason." "No," she said. "I think he's deciding which side of something he wants to be on before the something happens. And he came to see what side we were on first." "And what did he see?" She looked at him across the table. "I was fixing fence," she said. Something in Ethan's face moved. "Not running," he said. "Not running," she agreed. He was quiet for a moment. "We should tell Webb about the sheriff." "Already in the letter," she said. "I wrote it this afternoon." Well, Webb's response to that letter came faster than she expected. 6 days instead of 8, and it was longer than his previous letters, 5 pages with specific questions in the margins that she answered in a follow-up the same evening. What he'd found at the land office was worse than either of them had expected, and better, in the particular way that worse things sometimes were better when you were building a case. Pell, the surveyor, had filed the boundary adjustment for the Caldwell-Dunmore line using a reference marker that didn't exist. The 1879 filing cited a survey post placed in 1875 as its baseline, but the 1875 survey for that section of the county showed no such post at the referenced coordinates. The baseline was invented. The adjustment built on an invented baseline was, in Webb's language, without legal foundation and subject to nullification upon presentation of the original survey record. The clerk at the county office had not only processed the 1879 filing, he had also, Webb had discovered, received a payment in that same month from a Cheyenne bank account connected to the Dunmore family's business interests. The clerk had not volunteered this. Webb had found it through the bank records with the help of a contact she didn't ask about, and he didn't explain. The clerk was now very willing to speak further. She set Webb's letter down and sat at the desk for a long time. She thought about the South Boundary Creek running through its adjusted strip of bank, carrying whatever it was carrying down to where the cattle had been watering. She thought about 37 animals that were still alive and should have been fewer, would have been fewer if another winter had passed the same way. She thought about Ethan's father, Harlan Caldwell, who had filed the water rights in 1871 and built this place from $120 and a fraudulent letter of credit, and who had kept Dunmore at arm's length through the force of being exactly who he was. She thought about being 11 years old and her aunt sighing and the long accumulation of sighs that had followed, from people who saw her sighs and drew their conclusions and never looked further than the conclusions they had already drawn. She thought about Tuesday the steer, fully sound now, walking the east pasture in the April light with no memory of how close it had been. She picked up the pen. Yeesh. Ethan read Webb's letter at the table the next morning with his coffee going cold beside him. She watched him read. She'd learned to read his reading, the slight tension around his eyes when something landed hard, the way his jaw set when something made him angry, the stillness that meant he was processing something larger than his expression was showing. When he finished, he set the letter down with a care that was itself a kind of anger management. "He bought the filing," he said. "Yes." "He paid a man to invent a survey post and move a boundary line." "Yes." "And then he ran something through the creek for we don't know how long." "Webb thinks the boundary adjustment was the first move," she said. "Once he had legal claim to the strip of bank, whatever happened on that bank was on his land. Legally." Ethan looked at the letter again. That's not a man who wants to buy a ranch. That's a man who wanted to make sure he could take it. On his own terms and his own timeline," she said. "When the ranch had lost enough cattle that you had no choice." He stood up from the table. He went to the window and stood there with his back to her, and she let him stand. After a moment he said, "If you hadn't come." "I don't know what would have happened," she said, because she didn't. I do, he said quietly. 2 more bad winters. Maybe 1 more. I'd have been at the end of what I could hold. She said nothing. I wasn't going to advertise for... I almost didn't send that letter, he said. To the agency. I filled it out twice and threw it away twice. I thought it was... I didn't know what I was asking for. I just knew I needed something to change, and I didn't know how to change it myself. She looked at his back. I was carrying something she recognized from the barn nights, that particular weight of a man who had been very alone for a long time and had gotten so used to carrying it that he'd stopped noticing how heavy it was. You sent the letter, she said. He turned from the window. You sent it, she said again. That's the thing you did? Everything after that? That's just what happened when you did the thing. He looked at her. The gray eyes were doing what they did, showing her more than he was saying. Mabel, he said. She waited. He crossed to the table and sat down, closer to her than he usually sat, and put his hands flat on the table the same way he had on the night she'd told him about Ferris and the water samples. I know we came to this, practically, he said. I know that's what it was supposed to be. She was very still. I know I didn't make it easy. He looked at his hands. The beginning. What I showed on my face when I saw you. I've thought about that. You don't have to. I want to say it, he said. I looked at you and I thought about what Creech would say, and what Dunmore would say, and what everyone in that town was going to say, and I let that matter more than what was actually standing in front of me. He paused. You saw this ranch clearly the first afternoon. You saw what it needed. And I spent 2 weeks being embarrassed about something that said nothing about you and everything about me. She looked at him across the small distance of the table. I know what I am, she said carefully. I've known for a long time. I'm not easy to look at by the standards this world applies to women. I'm not small. I'm not decorative. I'm not the thing men imagine when they imagine a wife. I knew that before I came here. She paused. What I didn't know was whether any of it would matter to the specific man who opened the door. Does it? He said. Still, does it matter? What I did. She thought about it honestly, the way she tried to think about everything. Less than it did, she said, because of what came after. He nodded. He looked at her in the way he'd been looking at her since somewhere around the 6th week, when the careful mutual assessment had shifted into something she didn't have a clean word for yet, something that was built from barn nights and cold mornings, and letters to Cheyenne and a sick animal between them in the dark, the slow accumulation of a shared life that had started as an arrangement and become something else without either of them deciding it. I'd like to take you into Harlow, he said. This week, if the weather holds. Not for supplies. She looked at him. Just to go, he said. Together. In the daylight. She understood what he was saying and what he wasn't saying. In the daylight meant where people would see them. Together meant not the way he'd stood at the door that first day, slightly apart, letting her absorb the welcome alone. All right, she said. Well, they went on Thursday, which was clear and cold in the particular fresh way of April mornings, the sky a hard bright blue that demanded you look at it. She wore her better dress, the one that wasn't work appropriate, and her wool coat over it, and she did her hair properly instead of the practical way she did it for barn work. She was not going to pretend she didn't know people would look at her. She was going to look back. Ethan drove and she sat beside him on the wagon seat, and when they came into Harlow, he did not drop speed or move to the edge of the street. He drove straight down the center of it and tied up in front of the general store and came around to her side and offered his hand to help her down. She took it. He held it until she was on the ground and didn't drop it immediately. She saw Creech across the street and she saw him see them. His expression was not the one he'd had in January. It wasn't warm. She didn't expect warm from Dillard Creech and didn't need it. But it was something other than mockery, and that was its own kind of progress. They went into the store. She ordered what she needed. The woman behind the counter, who had smiled into her hand that first day in January, served her without the smile, replaced it with a careful neutrality that was at least an acknowledgement that the first response had been wrong, even if the second one wasn't quite right yet. Coming out of the store, she nearly walked into a woman she didn't know, younger than her, thin, with a baby on her arm and the look of someone who had been crying recently enough that it still showed. "I'm sorry," the woman said, stepping aside. "Don't be," Mabel said, and then because she'd seen that look before on enough faces, "Are you all right?" The woman looked at her with the surprise of someone not expecting the question from a stranger. My husband's horses, she said, with the flat tone of someone describing a disaster they're still too close to feel properly. 3 of them down sick. Nobody in Harlow knows what's wrong with them, and Doc Ferris says he doesn't know horses the way he knows people. Mabel looked at her. What are they showing? She said. The woman blinked. What? The sick horses. What are you seeing when you look at them? The woman described it haltingly. Not used to being asked, not sure of the vocabulary, but the description was specific enough for Mabel to understand the shape of it. She recognized what she was hearing. It was different from the cattle sickness, but not unrelated in its source, she suspected. And one of the things she'd learned in April was that the South Boundary Creek fed more than one property's water supply before it reached Ethan's land. Where's your spread? She said. The woman named a place she knew, 3 miles west, which put it downstream of the same creek. Tell me where you're keeping them, Mabel said. I'll come out tomorrow morning. The woman stared at her. Why would you? Because I know what you're describing, Mabel said, and I think I know where it's coming from. She went to the Hansen place the next morning. The woman's name was Iris Hansen, and her husband, a quiet man named Carl, met Mabel at the gate with an expression that mixed desperation and skepticism in equal parts. She didn't try to address the skepticism directly. She went to the horses. 2 of them were further along than the third, and what she found confirmed what she'd suspected. Different species, different presentation of symptoms, but the same underlying pattern, the same mineral accumulation, the same source. She told Carl Hansen, plainly and without drama, what she believed was happening, where she thought it was coming from, what she could do in the short term for his animals, and what the longer-term solution was going to require. He listened with his arms crossed and his face closed for the first part of it, and then something shifted. She could see it happen, the moment when what she was saying matched up with something he'd been seeing and not understanding, and his arms unfolded. The creek, he said. Yes. I've been watching it run funny I thought it was the spring melt. It's not the spring melt, she said. She spent 3 hours at the Hansen place that morning. She showed Iris what to watch for, wrote out what to give the animals and when, told her where to get what she'd need if Harlow didn't have it. Carl Hansen stood at her shoulder for most of it, asking questions that got better as the morning went on. When she got back in the wagon to leave, he was still standing in the yard. Mrs. Caldwell, he said. She looked at him. Is someone doing this? He said. To the water. She thought about Webb's letter, about the invented survey post and the land office clerk and the bank account in Cheyenne. There's an investigation underway, she said. I can't say more than that yet. But you should document what you've seen, write down the dates and what you observed, and keep it somewhere safe. He looked at her steadily. Dunmore, he said. It wasn't a question. She said nothing. He nodded once, slowly, and that was enough. By the end of April, she had been to 3 other properties. Not sought out. They came to her, word moving the way word moved in small territories, person to person, the Hansen visit becoming something people mentioned. Mabel Caldwell, who'd come out to look at the horses, who'd said something about the creek, who seemed to know what she was looking at. A boy of perhaps 15 rode out from the Greer place 2 miles east to ask if she'd come look at their cattle. She went. She found what she expected. She documented what she found and told the Greers to do the same. Ethan watched all of this with an expression she was still learning to fully read. It had something of the recalibrating look in it, and something else beneath that, something she thought might be pride, though he wasn't a man who displayed pride in any conventional way. One evening he said, "You're building a record." Across multiple properties, she said, the same pattern in the same creek's drainage area. That's not one rancher's complaint. That's a territory-wide problem with a documentable source. Webb can use that. Webb can take that to the circuit court judge, she said. Not just a boundary dispute. Water contamination affecting multiple landowners. That's a different weight of case. He looked at her. When did you plan this? She considered the question honestly. I didn't plan it exactly. I saw the pattern and I saw what it meant, and I started following where it led. That's planning, he said. That's just paying attention, she said. He shook his head slightly, the way he did when she said something that struck him and he didn't have an immediate response. Dunmore's going to know soon, he said, if he doesn't already. I think he already does, she said. I think Clara Dunmore's visit in February was the first sign that he knew something had changed. And the fact that he hasn't moved against us directly since then means he's thinking, Ethan said. Means he's worried, she said. Those aren't the same thing. Outside, the April evening was turning, the light going orange and low across the pasture where 37 cattle moved in the unhurried way of animals that were, on the whole, all right. The east fence held. The north line she'd repaired held. The water from the northwest source ran clear and cold and entirely uncontaminated. The ranch was not saved. It was not healed. There were debts still on it that would take years to pay down, and an ongoing legal action that could go in directions she couldn't fully predict, and a man in a good coat on the neighboring property who had been building towards something for 3 years and had not yet given up on it. But it was standing. The land was standing, and tomorrow morning she would get up before light and go to the barn and check each animal one at a time. And the morning after that she would do the same thing, and the morning after that, and somewhere in that accumulation of ordinary mornings, the thing would get done. She stood at the window and watched the orange light move across the pasture. Behind her, Ethan cleared the supper things from the table, something he'd started doing in March, quietly, without announcement, the same way he'd started other things. Not performing a change, but making one, which was the only kind that lasted. The ranch held itself against the evening in the particular way it had been holding itself since 1863, when a man from Illinois with less money than he needed had decided this piece of Wyoming ground was worth staying for. She thought it still was. Webb came to Harlow in person in the second week of May. She hadn't expected that. His letters had been precise and professional, and had given no indication that he was the kind of lawyer who traveled to his clients rather than summoning them to his office. But he arrived on the Tuesday stage. She would always notice Tuesdays now, something that had started with a steer and become a habit of mind, carrying a leather case that looked like it had seen considerable use, and Ethan brought him out to the ranch in the wagon that afternoon. He was younger than she'd pictured from his letters, perhaps 35, with a careful face that didn't give much away, and eyes that moved over things, with the systematic attention of someone who'd trained himself to see in a particular order. He shook Mabel's hand when they met, which not all men did, and he did it without the slight pause some men inserted when they decided whether a woman's hand was worth the formality. She made coffee, and they sat at the long table. The same table where she'd eaten bad beans on her first night, and where she and Ethan had talked through the cold midnights, and where she'd written letter after letter to Cheyenne in the lantern light. And Webb opened his case. "I came because the situation has developed faster than I anticipated," he said, "and because some of what I need to tell you is better said in person." She and Ethan looked at each other, then at Webb. "The good news first," he said. "The 1879 boundary adjustment has been formally challenged. I filed the challenge at the circuit court in Cheyenne 2 weeks ago, with the original 1871 survey record, the county clerk's affidavit regarding the payment he received, and a surveyor's report confirming that the baseline post cited in Pell's filing does not exist and has never existed at the cited coordinates." "And the judge?" Ethan said. "Circuit Judge Harmon has agreed to hear the case. He set a date for the 15th of June. Webb paused. "Harmon is not a man who favors the wealthy by default. He's reversed 3 fraudulent filings in the past 8 years. That's part of why I moved quickly. I wanted this in front of him specifically, before a scheduling conflict could put it in front of someone else." Mabel absorbed this. "And the less good news," she said. Webb looked at her steadily. "Dunmore knows. He retained legal counsel in Cheyenne the day after I filed. A man named Seward, who is expensive and thorough and has won cases he shouldn't have won." "What will Seward argue?" she said. "That the 1879 filing was made in good faith based on information available at the time, that the baseline post may have been removed or obscured between 1875 and 1879, natural causes, vandalism, survey error, and that Pell filed what he believed to be accurate. It's not a strong argument, but it doesn't need to be strong. It needs to introduce enough doubt to complicate the challenge." "The clerk's affidavit," Ethan said. "The payment." "Seward will argue the payment was for unrelated professional services. The clerk has signed an affidavit, but affidavits can be recanted and witnesses can be pressured." Webb paused. "The clerk is frightened. I want to be honest with you about that. He signed because he understood that not signing put him in a worse position, but frightened witnesses are unreliable witnesses. The kitchen was quiet except for the sound of the wind outside, which was doing what Wyoming wind did in May, moving without apology, indifferent to whatever was being decided indoors. "What do we need that we don't have?" Mabel said. Webb looked at her. The source of the contamination. Ferris's water samples established that something changed after the water crossed Dunmore's land. That's useful for the water contamination aspect, which I'm pursuing as a separate action. But to tie Dunmore directly to the boundary fraud, it helps to establish motive. Why that strip of bank specifically? If I can show that the adjusted boundary gave Dunmore access to introduce something into the water that damaged neighboring properties, that's motive for the fraud that's harder to argue away than a missing survey post. "We have that," Mabel said. Both men looked at her. "I have records from 4 properties in the creek's drainage area showing the same pattern of livestock sickness, all correlated with water sourced from that creek, all documenting the onset and the timeline." She got up and went to the desk and retrieved the folder she'd been building since March. Dated pages, observed symptoms, the Hansen horses, the Greer cattle, 2 others. She set it on the table in front of Webb. He opened it. He read carefully, turning pages with the deliberate attention of a man who knew how to read evidence. After a while, he looked up. "You collected this systematically." "I knew what I was looking for," she said. "When did you start?" "January," she said. "I suspected in January. I had enough to act on by March." He looked at the file and then at her and then at Ethan. "This is what I needed," he said quietly. "This is exactly what I needed." Webb stayed 2 days. He spent the first day going over everything she had, asking questions that were precise and sometimes uncomfortable, the kind of questions that poked at the weak places in an argument to see if they held. She answered them directly, acknowledged the places where her evidence was observational rather than scientific, and let him determine which pieces were useful and which weren't. He went to see Ferris on the second morning and came back with Ferris's agreement to testify in Cheyenne, which she hadn't been certain of. Ferris, it turned out, had been more bothered by the water samples than he'd shown in their first conversation, and the prospect of testifying about them had clarified his thinking on where his professional obligation lay. Creech came out on the second afternoon, uninvited and unexpected, and sat at the table with an expression that said he knew what he was doing and had made peace with it. "I knew Pell," he said. "The surveyor. We were in the same county when he did the Caldwell filing. I didn't know what he was filing, but I knew he was working for Dunmore's business interests at the time. I didn't put it together until this winter." Webb looked at him carefully. "Would you be willing to say that in front of Judge Harmon?" Creech looked at Mabel. She said nothing and let him look. "Yes," he said. After Creech left, Ethan stood at the door watching him ride out. "I didn't see that coming," he said. "I did," Mabel said, "or something like it. He told me in April which way he was leaning. He just needed to decide when." "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I wasn't certain," she said, "and because you have a history with Creech that I don't have, and I didn't want that history to make you shut a door that might open." He turned from the door. He looked at her for a long moment. "You manage things," he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was an observation, said with a quality she'd come to recognize as him working out something in real time. "I pay attention," she said, "and I don't close doors before I know what's on the other side." "That's the same thing," he said. She considered it. "Maybe it is." Webb left on Thursday's stage with everything she'd given him, packed carefully in his case, and a list of follow-up questions he'd send by post. She stood in the yard after the wagon pulled away with the particular feeling that comes when something you've been working toward has moved from your hands into someone else's, and all you can do now is wait and keep doing what you were doing before. She went back to the barn. The cattle were 41 now. They'd had 4 calves in April, which was not the number she'd hoped for, but was better than none. And all 4 were on their feet and eating and displaying the emphatic biological stubbornness of young animals that hadn't yet learned to be cautious. She checked them every morning the same way she checked everything. Methodically, one at a time, looking before touching, listening before acting. Tuesday was the largest animal in the east pasture now. Somewhere between January and May, he'd grown into himself, filled out across the back and shoulders in the way young cattle do when they're eating right and not fighting sickness. and he moved with the confidence of an animal that had been sick and recovered and carried the experience the way living things carry hard things. Not visibly, but somehow in the quality of how they moved through space. She'd never told Ethan his name. She told him that morning, in the east pasture, standing at the fence watching the animals move in the May light. He was quiet for a moment. "You named him after the day you found him." "I named them all," she said. "In my head. It makes me pay attention better." "What are the others called?" She told him. Some of the names were practical, and some were slightly absurd, and she said them without embarrassment, and he listened with an expression that moved through something she recognized as the residue of the man he'd been in January, the man who'd cared about how things looked from the outside, and came out the other side into something that was simply his real face, the one without performance in it. "There's one I've been calling Raymond," she said, nodding toward a steer in the south corner. Ethan looked. "Why Raymond?" "Because he's been trying to take the best position in the pasture from the others for 3 months, and keeps getting outmaneuvered," she said. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then he laughed. A real one. The kind that came up from somewhere without permission, and she laughed too, which she didn't do as often as she should, and for a moment they stood at the fence in the May morning laughing at a steer named after their enemy, and the land spread out around them indifferent and enormous and not unkind. June came in warm. The grass was up properly now, the pastures doing what they were meant to do, the rotation she'd established in January working as she'd designed it to. She walked the land differently than she'd walked it in January, not learning it anymore, but knowing it, moving through it with the ease of familiarity that comes from months of daily attention. She knew where the ground stayed wet longest after rain and where it dried first. She knew where the cattle preferred to shelter when the afternoon wind came up from the south. She knew the fence section on the northwest corner that would need significant work before next winter, and the section on the east that was solid for another 3 years at minimum. She knew this place. That knowledge had accumulated so gradually she hadn't noticed it accumulating, the way most important things accumulated. Not in a moment, but in the daily patient work of being present. The hearing in Cheyenne was on the 15th. Ethan left on the 13th to make the ride to the stage in time, and she stayed to manage the ranch, which they'd discussed and decided on together without much difficulty. Someone needed to stay. She was the more useful one here in terms of daily operations, and Webb didn't need both of them in the courtroom for this stage of the proceeding. The day he left, she found herself doing something she'd been doing in pieces since January, without fully acknowledging that she was doing it. She stood at the door of the house after the wagon disappeared and looked at the property she'd been living on for 5 months and thought, mine. Not in the legal sense, though that was real. Not in the romantic sense. In the more basic sense of a person recognizing the place they belonged to. She'd moved through a lot of spaces in her life. Her aunt's house, the boarding house in Cincinnati, Krause's farm outside Columbus, and had not felt it in any of them. She'd done her work and done it well and moved on, and she'd told herself the not belonging was just the condition of being her in a world that had its definitions, and she fell outside of most of them. She stood in the door of the Caldwell ranch house on a June morning in Wyoming, and understood that the definitions had always been the problem, not her, Sam. Ethan came back on the 18th. She heard the wagon from the barn and came out, and she read him at distance the same way she'd learned to read the cattle. The quality of his movement, what it told you before he was close enough to speak. He looked tired. He looked like a man who had been through something and come out of it on the right side, but without the clean satisfaction that courtroom victories were supposed to deliver in stories, because real things were rarely as clean as stories made them. He climbed down from the wagon, and she waited. "The boundary adjustment has been nullified," he said. "Harmon ruled the filing was fraudulent. The 1871 survey stands. The bank strip is ours." She let out a breath she'd been holding for longer than she'd admitted. The clerk's testimony held? Webb kept him from falling apart, barely. He tied the horse and turned to face her. Seward was good. He did what Webb said he'd do. Pushed hard on the good faith argument, tried to make the payment to the clerk look incidental. But Ferris's assessment of the water samples and your documentation from the 4 properties, Webb used it to establish that the strip of bank was valuable specifically for what it allowed Dunmore to do to the water. That motive argument was what tipped it. And the water contamination case? Still open. Webb says it'll take another 3 months minimum, maybe longer. Dunmore's fighting that one harder because the damages could be significant. He paused. 3 of the other affected landowners have joined the action. Hansen and the Greers and a family north of here I've never even met. She thought about Carl Hansen in his yard, the way he'd listened, the single nod at the end that was its own kind of solidarity. What about Dunmore? She said. Ethan was quiet for a moment. He was in the courtroom. He sat in the back and he listened to all of it, and he didn't show much on his face. Seward's going to appeal the boundary ruling. He looked at her. This isn't finished. I know, she said, but we have the ruling. The record is made. She paused. He can appeal, but he can't unmake what's in front of Judge Harmon now. He can't unfile the clerk's affidavit. He can't unhave the water analysis and 5 months of documented sickness across 4 properties. She said it plainly, not triumphant, just laying out what was true. He's running out of ground. Ethan looked at her. He was still tired, but something else was coming through it, something that was close to what she'd seen in his face on the morning after the barn night with the sick animal, when something had shifted between them. The day I left, he said. Were you all right? All right? Here alone? I was fine, she said. I know you were fine, he said. That's not what I asked. She looked at him. Were you all right? He said again, quietly. She thought about standing at the door watching the wagon leave, about the word mine in her chest. I was more than all right, she said. I was at home. He looked at her for a long moment. The June light was coming in from the west, long and warm, the way it came in on the good evenings when the weather was making up for the rest of the year. Good, he said. And then simply, without preamble or ceremony, I missed you. She held that. She was not a woman who received things easily. She'd had too many years of things being taken or withheld or offered with conditions she couldn't meet. Receiving something offered plainly, without strings, still required a moment. I know, she said, which was not the same as saying it back, and also was. He nodded. He unhitched the horse and led it toward the barn, and she fell in beside him, and they walked together through the June evening toward the ordinary work that was still waiting to be done. Summer moved through the ranch the way summer did in Wyoming, briefly, urgently, as if it knew it had less time than it wanted. The calves grew. The herd strengthened. She continued the rotation and the supplement protocol and the individual daily assessment that had become as natural to her as waking, and the losses that had defined the previous years slowed to the kind that came from age and injury and the inevitable arithmetic of living things, not from the slow poisoning of a water source upstream. The second water source she and Ethan had opened in February now served the entire south section. It was more work to maintain than the creek access would have been, but it was clean and it was certain, and she was not going to trust the South Boundary Creek until the contamination case was resolved and the source of the problem had been formally addressed. She said this to Iris Hansen when Iris came out in July, the first of what became a loosely regular occurrence. Not a planned arrangement, just the pattern that formed when 2 practical women discovered they had useful things to say to each other. Iris had grown up on a ranch in Nebraska and had her own knowledge, different from Mabel's and sometimes in disagreement with it, which Mabel found more valuable than agreement would have been. You trust it when the courts say it's clean, Iris said. I trust it when I test it, and it's clean, Mabel said. The courts will say what they say. Iris looked at her with an expression she'd been seeing more often from the women in the Harlow area since spring, a kind of assessment that wasn't hostile and wasn't entirely comfortable, the look of a person deciding how to update a category that had been set before you arrived. You're not what people said, Iris said. What did people say? Iris was quiet for a moment, which was itself an answer. Whatever it was, Mabel said, it wasn't new. And it stopped being interesting to me around the time I stopped letting it determine what I did. Webb's final letter on the water contamination case arrived in September. Dunmore had settled, not admitted fault. She'd known better than to expect that, had told Ethan not to expect it, had said that men with that much pride and that much money bought their way out of admissions, the way other people bought their way out of debt. But the settlement required the cessation of whatever process on his land had been affecting the creek, a payment into a fund divided among the affected landowners, and, most significantly, a formal agreement that the 1871 water rights registration for the South Boundary Creek, as it pertained to Ethan Caldwell's property, was valid, enforceable, and not subject to future challenge. Webb's letter noted, in his careful professional language, that the settlement amount was substantial and that Dunmore had not agreed to it willingly. He also noted, in a sentence that was the closest Webb came to editorializing, that the multi-property documentation had been decisive, that a case built on one rancher's complaint could be argued down to a property dispute, but a case built on 5 years of documented, corroborating records across multiple affected properties was a different kind of case entirely. She read this sentence twice. She thought about January, about standing at the South Boundary Creek in the cold, breaking the surface ice, smelling the water, about the jar she'd boiled clean and filled and sealed with wax, about the dated log on the barn wall, about the piece of paper she'd handed Carl Hansen in his yard and told him to keep somewhere safe. None of it had felt like building a case at the time. It had felt like paying attention, like doing the next thing that needed doing, like the patient daily accumulation of understanding that was the only way she'd ever known how to work. She set the letter down. She looked at the kitchen, at the supplies on the shelves that were organized the way she'd organized them and stayed organized now because Ethan had learned her system and used it. She looked at the hook by the door where her coat hung next to his. She looked at the piece of paper pinned near the window where she tracked the cattle's individual conditions, updated daily in her handwriting, and, on the days she'd been in the South pasture too long, in Ethan's small, precise handwriting instead. She thought about a woman who had stood in a frozen street in January and heard a man's voice carrying across the cold air and calling her a barn, and who had kept walking. She thought about what it had cost to keep walking. Not nothing. It had cost things she'd been paying for so long that she'd stopped noticing the payments. The particular tiredness of spending your life being the target of other people's easy certainties about what you were. The constant low-level work of deciding every morning that those certainties were wrong and not letting the decision slip. Not letting the accumulated weight of being seen incorrectly bend you into the shape other people had decided you were. She'd paid those costs for 29 years. She was still paying some of them. She didn't think she'd ever stop entirely because the world didn't change as fast as a person could, and the woman who stepped off the stage in Harlow in January was always going to be, in certain people's minds, a particular kind of target. But the land knew what it knew. The cattle that were healthy and alive in September had been sick and dying in January. The water that now ran clean through the north source had replaced the water that had been slowly damaging everything downstream for years. The record that sat in a courthouse in Cheyenne had been made, carefully, piece by piece, by a woman who'd been told her whole life that she was too much of certain things and not enough of others. She didn't feel triumphant. She'd suspected she wouldn't. Triumph was for people who'd been surprised by their own capabilities, and she'd always known what she was capable of. What she felt was something quieter and more durable than triumph. The particular satisfaction of a thing done correctly. The way a fence post driven to the right depth satisfies in a way that a fence post driven too shallow never quite does, regardless of whether it holds in the short term. She heard Ethan come in from the east pasture. She turned from the window. The first blizzard of the season came in late October, faster than either of them had expected, and harder than the early weather had suggested. She'd been watching the signs for 2 days. The specific quality of the cloud build to the northwest, the way the cattle had started moving without the usual afternoon looseness, the pressure in the air that she'd learned over 10 months to read with her whole body. But the speed of it still caught them partially underprepared in the south pasture. They got the animals in together, moving in the way they'd learned to move together over months of working the same ground. Not choreographed, not perfectly coordinated, but with the mutual understanding of people who knew each other's decisions before they were made. She took the west side, he took the east, and they worked the cattle in from opposite ends and met in the middle. And the snow was coming in sideways and serious by the time the last animal was through the barn door. She stood in the barn doorway for a moment, breathing hard, the snow driving past her into the dim, warm interior where 41 cattle stood in the familiar closeness of animals that had learned to trust the space they were kept in. Ethan appeared beside her. They stood in the doorway together and watched the storm come in over the land, the way it moved across the flat distances and turned them white and indistinct, the way it made the visible world small and the invisible world very large. "Worse than last year?" he said. "About the same," she said. "Maybe a little worse. We're in better shape than last year." "Yes," she said. "We are." He looked at the storm for a moment. "I've been thinking about the north pasture, next spring. There's a section that's been underused since my father's time. He had plans for it that he never got to." I know the section, she said. I've been thinking about it too. He looked at her. What were you thinking? Rotation expansion, and there's a drainage issue on the east edge that's been limiting the grass yield. Fixable, with some work in the spring thaw. He was quiet for a moment. I was thinking the same thing about the drainage. She looked at him sidelong. 3 times, she said. What? That's the 3rd time this fall you've been thinking the same thing I was thinking, she said. At the same time. He was quiet for a moment. I wasn't going to mention it. Why not? Because it's... He paused. Because it means you've been inside this ranch long enough that you think about it the way I do. She looked at the storm. Is that a problem? No, he said. No, it's not a problem. He paused again, and she heard in the pause the thing he was working toward saying, the man who talked differently in the late hours and in the barn, and in the particular honesty that hard weather seemed to produce in him. It means this is yours, the same way it's mine. And I should have said that plainly, a long time ago. She turned to look at him. He was looking at the storm, his face in profile, the beard he kept trimmed now instead of the unmanaged version she'd first seen in Harlow, the lines around his eyes that had relaxed over 10 months from the particular tightness of a man holding everything alone. I didn't come here to be a guest, she said. I know that now, he said. I don't think I knew it in January. No, she said. You didn't. He turned to look at her. The snow was in his hair and on his coat, and the barn warmth was coming out around them both, the animal smell of it, the particular sanctuary of a well-tended space on a bad night. I didn't know a lot of things in January, he said. Neither did I, she said. That's not a failure. That's just where January was. He looked at her with the gray eyes that she knew as well now as any face she'd known in her life. Better than her aunt's face. Better than Krause's. Better than anyone who'd been certain they knew what she was and had been wrong. What do you know now? He said. It was a real question. He asked real questions. This man she'd married on a practical basis and stayed with on something more than that. She thought about it honestly, the way she tried to think about everything. She knew the south pasture and its drainage and which section held moisture too long and which was dry by June. She knew that Tuesday still favored his left side in very cold weather, just slightly, just enough that she checked it, and that it never came to anything. She knew that Ethan made better coffee than she did, and that she was a better judge of weather, and that they had both, without discussion, sorted the household along these lines and several others. She knew that she could read his silences now the way she read the land. Not perfectly, not always, but well enough to know the difference between the silence that needed space and the silence that needed someone to sit in it with him. She knew that belonging was not given. It was not assigned or conferred or arrived at by decree. It was built, the way everything real was built, in the accumulation of ordinary days, in the work done without an audience, in the decision made repeatedly and imperfectly, and without guarantee that it would be returned. She'd built it here, on this ground, in this cold, beside this man, among these animals in this particular sky, and this specific water that was now clean and flowing as it should. She had built belonging out of everything nobody thought she had, and the lesson of it, if a thing lived through in the body and not just understood in the mind could be called a lesson, was not that she had been extraordinary. She was not extraordinary. She was a woman from Cincinnati with rough hands and a frizzy hair and a stubbornness people had been trying to cure for 29 years. She'd paid attention, and she'd stayed, and she'd done the next thing that needed doing, and she'd done it again, and the accumulation of that, the daily ordinary unglamorous accumulation, had become something that looked from the outside like something larger than what it was made of. That was the truth of it. That was what she knew. She didn't say all of that to Ethan. Some things were too large for a barn doorway in a blizzard, and some things didn't need to be said because they were already understood, and she was learning which was which. I know this place, she said, and I know you, and that's more than I had a year ago. He was quiet for a moment. Then he reached out and took her hand, the same hand he'd helped her down from the wagon with in Harlow in April, and held it the same way. Not brief, not performative, just a thing he was doing because he'd decided to do it. Come inside, he said. I'll make the coffee. She looked at the storm one more time, the white distances, the land she knew under the snow, the 41 animals breathing warm behind her, the fence lines holding, the water running clean to the north. She turned away from it and went inside with him. The storm came in full that night, and the ranch held against it the way it had been holding against things since 1863. And in the morning, the world was white and new and required the same work it always required, and she got up before light and went to do it. Not because she had to prove something, not anymore. Because it was hers, and she was its, and that was enough.